My name's Monk Rowe. I'm very pleased to have Scott Yanow with me today, who is an author, a jazz journalist, and quite a resource for jazz knowledge. That's the way I'm going to introduce you. I hope that works.
Sure, sure.
I was reading about, from your website, your experience of going to college with LPs, and I really related to that. And your description, it was quite a leap you made in a short amount of time from Pete Fountain to John Coltrane and Pharoah Sanders. Can you remember how that music affected you, expanding your listening palette back then?
Remember, this is like 1970 is when I first discovered Dixieland. It was a local radio show. And I noticed in the Los Angeles Times, it mentioned it was like 5 to 6 p.m. on an FM station, Monday through Friday. So I thought, well, this is happy music. I'll see what this is like. And it took a couple of days, and then I was addicted to that. And then about 6 months later, I discovered Chuck Cecil's swinging years, and I got into the swing era. But when I went to college, all I listened to basically was Dixieland and swing for the first month or two. And look, I happened to be in a dormitory where there were a lot of musicians, and they would look at my records. I had 25 records, and they'd say, "Oh, what a huge collection!" You know, they thought 25 was huge, and of LPs, and they looked through a Dukes of Dixieland, Al Hurt, Pete Fountain, and they thought I was crazy, of course. I heard from them the names Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, and didn't know anything about them at all. So I went to a used record store, and for $1.99, I saw a Charlie Parker record that had a lot of unfamiliar tunes like Night in Tunisia and Grooving High, but it did have one song I heard of called White Christmas. And I said, oh, I heard the song because it was a request on a radio broadcast that he did. So I listened to that each day, three or four times. It took me a little while to get into it, but by the end of the week, the doors were open. And then from then, I was just very curious about all other eras of jazz. So I very quickly went through, and I loved Eric Dolphy, and I got into Thelonious Monk. And within a few months, I was into John Coltrane, not just his early stuff, but the latest screaming things he did with Pharoah Sanders. And that's when the musicians knew for sure that I was crazy. I pretty much lost them.
It's so interesting you say that because I shouldn't talk about myself, but very briefly, I went out to get my first John Coltrane record because someone said you should listen to him, and I picked up Ohm, and that was not a great place to start for me, and I'm afraid it scared me off for quite a while.
But it was just the basic idea. I like to hear how it all evolved and how it all connects together. Mm-hmm. And because I'm lucky enough to start with Dixieland and then 1920s jazz, I still love listening to that today. Where most critics and jazz journalists, if they don't really go further back than Charlie Parker, usually. They Benny Goodman and Duke Ellington, but they're not really going to go back to the earliest music because the recording quality doesn't agree with them, and it seems too simple. They don't quite understand or appreciate how it all connects together.
Do you feel that there's a determination on their part that music wasn't really an art form or worthy of being an art form, thus worthy of critiquing?
Well, I always thought the art form connection to jazz was kind of overdone, to tell you the truth. Now, of course, it was an art form from the very beginning. I mean, Buddy Bolden most likely played music that could be considered artistic, and certainly by the time recordings were made, the original Dixieland Jazz Band, I mean, it's way ahead of its time, compared to the most of the music that was recorded. Most of the music from 1917 or so that's on records is really unlistenable at this point, because it's just too primitive or it was just very predictable. But jazz still sounds fresh, even if it's over 100 years old, if it's well played,
Can we pursue that a little bit about the art form? Because I've been fascinated by that over the years, and that it kind of went hand in hand with losing much of the audience, it seems like. Once jazz became an art form, it lost some popularity and became almost like classical music is in the United States.
An art form is fine if you're going after grants or you want Congress to declare jazz, America's national treasure. That's all nice. But when it comes to building up an audience, I mean, jazz is basically the most fun music in the world. It's the most adventurous music. The idea of seeing a group come on stage and make up the music as they go along, which in some more advanced eras of jazz, it's practically free improvisation. That's exciting. That's much more exciting to me than seeing a pop group try to recreate their records on stage, nostalgic audience. And the problem with jazz being declared an art form, it was fine in the 40s, because trying to separate jazz from popular music. But by doing that, you end up separating jazz from popular music, and jazz got rid of it. For a variety of reasons, jazz was no longer being played for dances, even though the music itself is danceable much of the time. And by doing that, you lost a lot of the audience. The audience wants your rhythm and blues and eventually rock and roll and Motown and everything else. And if you look at what the most popular music in the world is, generally it's danceable music. Even in jazz, one of the most popular styles, well, Latin jazz, and swing is still popular, and some parts of fusion that are rock oriented where it's danceable. That's much more popular than bebop or hard bop, and yet bebop and hard bop are danceable. It's just that it's not danceable if you don't have a dance floor. And if people
That's true. I love the practical considerations that come into what happens to music. Well, I could dance to it, but there's no music because this place seats like 40 people and there's no place to move around.
No, you can't dance to it if there's no way to dance.
Yeah. Have you ever had an occasion, at a cocktail party or something, where you get into a discussion about what you do and someone asks you to explain what the heck are these musicians doing after they play the melody? They start doing this stuff and I get lost. Do you have a way of explaining that in layman's terms?
Well, it would depend on who it is that's playing, but generally they're playing off of the chord changes. They're playing the song, but they're not stating the melody over and over again. That if you listen closely, you could tell. Let's say if they're playing a standard song, you could tell by listening closely, you could tell where it starts again, where the chorus begins, and they're basically creating new melodies on the song itself.
Yeah.
They do that in queer jazz. That the idea is just to come up with new ideas and new themes along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say, well, just listen closely and have an open mind. That's really all you can.
This is a wide open question. Does music need to have a meaning beyond the fact that it's music?
No. No, it doesn't have to. Some songs and some musicians do look for deeper meaning in their music, but quite often what they're doing is they're playing the song or they're playing what they're feeling at the moment. The way to judge or appreciate jazz is really just, does it move you and is it colorful and do you enjoy it? It's really up to the individual.
Yeah, I like that answer, and I asked it partly because you had talked about bop and the fact that sometimes the musicians sacrificed feeling for precision and emotion for speed.
Classic bebop, it was such a virtuosic music. The music from the mid-40s to, let's say, 1950 or so that Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker and many others were playing. There is feeling, but the notes are often flying by so fast that, the technique sort of overrides it to an extent. But the thing about Charlie Parker, let's say, I always regarded as like arguably the greatest saxophonist ever. If you slow down his solos to half speed, you find that every note makes sense much of the time. Even if it blazes by you can't quite follow it if you're hearing it for the first time or so. But if you listen to it at a slower speed, it's all there. There's a definite lot.
Good point. So you got a degree in accounting, and you ended up as a jazz editor for Record Review. Was there a point where you consciously said, I think I'll try to make a living writing about jazz?
Profession, really. If you think musicians don't get paid well, then you should look at the average jazz writer. But it is possible to make a living from it, but you basically have to hustle all the time, and you have to be a freelancer and be open to a wide variety of assignments. But yes, there was a time. I mean, it got to the point really where because I spent so much time on jazz, my accounting career was declining anyway, and it finally reached a point where I was making more money from doing jazz than accounting. So I just said, well, the accounting's interfering with my life, so I take a chance.
So I'm trying to picture you, writing some of your early record reviews, and most likely from LPs. Do you recall the listening process before you wrote? Did you listen multiple times to a record? Did you play certain tracks more than once? That kind of thing.
Yeah, the key is, for me, is to listen to it closely once and to take notes along the way. And if the music seems too difficult or complex for me, then I listen to it again. You listen to it until you can appreciate its good and bad points, really. Much of the time, if I put on a straight ahead jazz record, most of the time, after one listen, I pretty much can explain to and describe the music to readers.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we had an email exchange about this comment that was written by any number of people about writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And is the fact that music is an abstract, mostly abstract art form, is it a challenge to put it into words for you? Or was it early on?
Not really. That quote might have been said by Thelonious Monk. At least I saw it described to him once, but I don't know. It's probably been around for 100 years. I've never really had difficulty because the main purpose in writing a review is to describe the music enough to readers so they'll have an idea whether they'll like it or not. Whether I enjoy it or not is less important than whether it's something that they would want to acquire. So it's just a matter of describing what does it sound like, without comparing it too much to other musicians. How does it sound compared to other music of the time period and to other recordings that they've done in the past? And it's not that hard. Maybe it's because I had this training when I was with Record Review, which was the magazine I wrote for 1977 to 1984. Back a million years ago. I had, among other things, I had a column called Shorts, in which I reviewed about 20 albums, maybe 30 words apiece. It was all on one page, and I'd give it a low grade at the end. And I learned how to not to waste words, really. Just what does it sound? What's on the record, and what does it sound like? And then if you just give those two basic things to readers, they should be able to decide.
And then they go to the record store and like the old days where we used to thumb through all the records and they might find the one you're describing.
Yeah. And of course now they'll buy it through the internet or buy it somewhere else, but it's still the same basic idea, really. If it's let's say it's a fusion record, I'll mention somewhere along the way that it's rock oriented or that they're using electronic instruments, and that way people that are into that music will have an idea that maybe it's something that will interest them.
So in those 30-word summarizing pattern, when you get into more lengthy reviews, at what point does your personal opinion start to enter into your writing?
Well, there's always a certain amount of that anyway, because you have to edit it, and you want to. Is it a favorable review, or was the album a disappointment for one reason or another? There's a certain amount of that, but that should be secondary to just describing what it sounds like and being accurate. In what it describes like. And for readers, it's up to them to a certain extent to maybe read a few other things from each writer to get an idea whether their tastes are similar to yours. Because a lot of times I'll read stuff and I'll know that maybe this is an album that I would like, but the writer, the journalist, obviously doesn't like it. They write off. They're not into swing, but so I write it off. But I'll say, well, he's saying it's a swing record, so maybe that'll be interesting to me. So. There should be enough clues, and there should be enough clues in the reviews so the reader will have an idea.
Have you ever had occasion to dislike a record so much that you pass on the review?
Once in a great while. If it's not jazz, if it's outside of jazz, or say it's a rap record or something, then I won't even review it. And if it's a situation which is true of several of the magazines I write for, where I get to choose what I'd like to review. And I put it on and it's kind of dull, then I think, well, maybe some other time, and I'll switch to another record.
Mm-hmm.
If I assign something, like say for downbeat or jazz is, then I pretty much have to review it. But in most cases, they assign me things that are complementary to my tastes anyway.
Oh, okay. Some of our best known and iconic musicians, jazz musicians, have taken a turn at trying to enter the pop market or become more popular. Have you had instances where you're reviewing some of our heroes and all of a sudden they're covering Beatles songs or something like that?
Well, they'll do that once in a while, and I don't blame them for trying to make some more money. But on the other hand, my responsibility is really towards my readers. It's not towards musicians, and it's certainly not towards other critics. It's, because sometimes you'll read something from a journalist and they're obviously trying to impress, their other writers, or they're trying to cozy up to musicians. But no, I don't. I want the readers to know that if they're going to spend $15 or $20 on a CD, it'll most likely be something that they'll like, or something that, at least in a style of music, that interests them.
Mm-hmm. What kind of feedback over the years have you received from the artists you review? Let me rephrase. Are you more likely to get contacted by aggravated musicians who didn't like what you wrote, rather than people thanking you for your review?
Pretty even, really. When you're a jazz critic, you have to know that if a musician compliments you, that means that you like their last record. They say you're a great writer. That means you wrote a great review for them. And if you wrote a negative review, then you're a bum. So you can't really take their opinions too seriously much of the time, unless it's someone you know and they're being really honest about it. I mean, it's kind of funny. There was one saxophonist who, because of the internet, reviews stay up there forever. And I wrote something for the All Music Guide maybe in 1995 on him, and he just criticized the review I wrote, 30 years ago. So I said, well, that's comforting, because I know that if you don't like what I write about your current record, I'm not going to hear from you till 2050.
I recall doing an interview with a wonderful guy, a veteran trombonist, and I happened to bring up something that Gary Giddens wrote, and he immediately said, "Does he play anything? Has he ever played anything?" Like he didn't even let me finish my sentence. It was like that was the hurdle for him in order to give some kind of credence to what Gary wrote. Had he played something? Do you think that's important?
Well, it's important for a jazz critic to have as much knowledge as possible, and if they play a little bit of music, that's good, but it's not necessary. I mean, Whitney Balliet, I always thought it was the best of all writers on jazz. He was always my favorite. You could read his music I mean, you could read his reviews, and you could almost hear the music of the people he's writing about. And I think he played drums a little bit, but he didn't really play music very often. So it's not necessary at all. I mean, if you have musicians reviewing musicians, it's going to be an obvious conflict of interest eventually, because they'll probably, they might be complimenting them because they want to get a gig, or maybe they're a friend of theirs, and it's not that way. It's a different profession. I mean, writers are not frustrated musicians. Now, if you hear some of them play, you might say they're frustrating musicians, but not frustrated.
Okay. Yeah, and
fun. A lot of it was, that's not really, that was never my aim.
I think
that's true.
I think musicians writing about musicians could tend to also use too much sort of inside language that the average reader might find a little alienating.
Well, you can't have an attitude in your writing. I mean, there's some writers where I feel like I need a dictionary to figure out what they're talking about, and that's not what they aim for. I use small words. I mean, my vocabulary is not that large. If I have to, know French to be able to figure out what they're saying, then they failed.
Okay. Well, speaking of words, I wanted to ask you about. I've been reading, your jazz singers book, and by the way, now I own 2 copies because Jeannie Cheatham sent me your book. So she must have liked what you wrote about her. And a couple of things I wanted to mention. I was very happy to turn to page 233 under Nancy Wilson and see my favorite LP of all time, the one she did with Cannonball. The other thing I enjoyed was your talk about what makes a jazz singer. And if you don't mind, I wonder if you could share your perspective on that again.
It's always a tricky thing because with jazz, there's a lot of instances where it's borderline. Is Rosemary Clooney a jazz singer? Well, she sings jazz tunes and she swings, but does she improvise much? One could debate about that. And of course, one always debates about Frank Sinatra and Tony Bennett. Are they really jazz singers? Well, sort of and sort of not. Where someone like, say, Kurt Elling or Betty Carter or Mel Torme, they're definitely jazz singers. So, I mean, the quality that is needed is that they need to improvise to a certain extent, not scat sing, but be able to, at least in their phrasing and in their use of words, make the song their own. Really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been a number of singers over the years who have come out with a debut album, and I don't know if it's their choice or the record companies, and they'll get Ron Carter and people of that talent level to play behind them. And then when you listen to it, you say, well, it's a jazz trio, but it's not really a jazz singer.
Yeah, like I say, it's tricky. Don't sing as much of the time, but they might not sing jazz 100% of the time. You just have to look at their overall career. And then there are jazz musicians, and it's behind them, but they're just singing straight. Generally, if a singer does the song the same way 1 month to another, they're probably not a jazz singer.
Okay.
I mean, there's someone like Tony Bennett that, he'll perform a song and he'll sing a chorus straight. Then there'll be a half chorus of a sideman playing, and then he comes back on and finishes the song. So I remember seeing him once, and like every song was 2 choruses. So,
I see.
That doesn't mean he's not good, and that doesn't mean that he didn't put on an enjoyable show.
Yeah.
Still.
Here's what you wrote about Bing Crosby. He's probably the first great white male jazz singer who was not a musician. So it begs a question, when does a singer get to be considered a musician? And most singers, I think, would object to that statement. I'm not sure most, but a lot of them would. In your mind, when does a singer become a musician?
Well, I guess I would amend that statement too, because that was written like 20 years ago. I think I would say that he was the first white jazz singer, important white jazz singer who was not an instrumentalist. That's how it. But because singers are generally musicians too. It's just some are very good musicians, and some of them are very good. Some of them are masterful ones. So I would probably amend that statement.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't disagree with the statement because some singers who know the craft, who know their keys, and who know how things work on stage, then to me, okay, I'm working with another musician. Those singers who don't know those things, we tend to wish they did. I guess is the best way I can put it.
A lot of them are showbiz performers, so that's a little different.
Okay.
Not necessarily jazz singers.
Mm-hmm. Well, a book like your Jazz Singers takes some serious organization and planning. How do you know when you're done with a book like this?
The Singers book is kind of crazy because there are so many singers, and it seemed like when I was writing the book, it seemed like I discovered 5 new singers, 5 current singers that were new every week. So it was getting to the point where if I don't cut off the book now, it's going to be 3 times as big.
I see.
Book, okay, I did a book on jazz guitarists. Then there was maybe one new guitarist a week, but with singers, it just seemed like they were all over the place, and most of them are good. So it was difficult. I wanted to include a lot of local singers who were talented and who, with a little bit of luck, could become famous. So that's why I had 500, and it could have been 2,000 really, but I actually cut it off finally. Kind of the historic ones, but the current scene, there were just so many.
Yeah, would have been an extremely thick book, also.
With everyone, yes, definitely.
Yeah. I was wondering about your choice of adjectives, using words to describe the singers right off the bat. Do you have? I'm almost picturing like a list of adjectives that you go to that you think are relevant for this person and that you haven't used in a while.
Not too much. The hardest part about writing a book like that, when you're describing the style of maybe 500 people, is not to have too much repetition. So if you call someone colorful, that you don't want to use that word too soon again, maybe 4 entries later. It's just a matter of making it readable, really. A lot of them are pretty similar to each other anyway. They're all. So no, I didn't have a list really. It just whatever comes. That's really how I write. I usually don't write with an outline either. I might have a little outline just so I know how a book's going to progress, but in general, it's pretty spontaneous. And then I'll go back and proofread it several times and fix it. Anything that might have been repetitious or didn't fit.
Yeah. Do you have other people proofread your work?
Not usually.
Oh.
In the case of a couple of books, the publishers had proofreaders there, and it was just a matter of putting accents over French names and Spanish names and those kind of things. But in general, no one's ever gone through my book and said, "Well, this is factually wrong." So if there's a mistake, it's mine.
Okay. Well, has your fact checking, the way we get our information obviously has progressed a lot since your career started as a writer. Has the internet made your life easier, or has it thrown up other issues you hadn't expected?
Mostly easier, really. In the old days, 70s and 80s, let's say, if you wrote a letter to England to request an album, it'd take 2 weeks to get there, and then take 2 weeks to get the response and maybe the album. So it'd be like 4 weeks before you receive what it is you asked for. Well, now, if you send a note, they get it a couple seconds later, and they can respond quickly. And it might still take 2 weeks for the record to get here, but at least the correspondence is so much faster. I mean, I'll always appreciate email because I remember that sitting there. You have to wait and wait because that's just how it was. It's easier also in getting being able to gather a lot of information. You know, instead of going to a library or even looking at my books, I can look up things very quickly. You know, you have to take a lot of it with a grain of salt because some of it's just not accurate. You know, look at Wikipedia. 80% of the time it's correct, but every once in a while there'll be something that isn't, and so you have to check, several places.
I see. Once you hear the same thing from 2 or 3 sources, you feel better about using it.
Yeah, especially like birth dates, for vintage performers, because there might be 3 different dates for them, and you have to look it up and see, and guess which one is probably the most accurate. This kind of thing. But yeah, it's made it easier. I mean, of course, emails and text is constant distraction, so you have to be able to not pay too much attention to maybe 5 minutes and try to actually get the work done.
Uh-huh. Are you a writer that works better with a deadline?
And if I don't have a deadline, I'll give myself one. And I always try to give myself a deadline in general of maybe a week or at least several days before other people expect it. So that no one ever complains if I send in something too early.
Oh, that's good for the in regards to the competition with other writers, because probably not everybody is that way.
You have to be sort of disciplined. I mean, when you're a jazz writer and you're a freelance, you're your own boss. It's really your own business, and you have to look at it that way. And I live off of to-do lists. I have constant to-do lists, So that way, because sometimes I have like 8 or 10 assignments going on at once. Now they're not all due today. They're due over maybe the next 3 weeks or so. So I write down what day I'm going to work on it.
Mm-hmm.
Making that time, and it's kind of being organized. Because if you're organized, you can get an awful lot out.
Is there a bit of an industry standard about how to charge for what you do?
I have no idea what other people charge. Maybe I don't have the courage to ask them. I figure if I ask them, it's kind of invading their privacy. And then they don't ask me because, if I gave out that information, someone would try to undercut me, of course, or vice versa. And,
right. So everybody's sort of protecting themselves, I guess, with that kind of information.
I don't know what other people charge for liner notes. I just know what I do.
Yes.
But I know that people don't wince. They don't look at me with horror when I give them the price. So I figure I'm on the right track.
And have you ever had to bargain with somebody to get a sort of coveted gig?
I didn't quite understand.
Well, I'm wondering if you ever had a chance to, have what could be a long-term writing assignment, but you had to bargain with the people about the price.
Oh, occasionally. Most of the time it's reasonable because I try not to overcharge, and most of the time I let them name the price. Then I say, well, how about this instead? And it works. You have to have a little bit of courage about that, but you also have to know what you're worth to an extent. I mean, if I did line notes for $50, everybody would use me, but I'd never make any money, and you'd also have less respect. You see, and this is what I tell musicians on a slightly different topic when they let their music get streamed. If you give something away for free, then it's considered worthless. If it's not, if you can't charge a reasonable price, then then you don't think that highly of yourself, and the people that are hiring you aren't going to think that highly of you. They won't respect you as much. Now, on the other hand, you don't want to overcharge them, bankrupt them for doing a review. So, you have to find a balance, see what's reasonable.
Yeah, that's a slippery slope because people feel they need to take advantage of this amazing spread of information. Well, I better get my music on there too. But the return on it has become very low, if anything.
Yeah, it's just a matter of knowing what you're worth, really, and don't undersell yourself. But on the other hand, be realistic about it.
What's your opinion about? We were going back a little bit to the concept of jazz as an art form. Do you have any opinion about the thriving business of jazz education in the country?
Well, I think jazz education is a good thing in that it's good when it teaches young musicians the fundamentals and the basics. How do you play your instrument properly? How, how do you improvise? That sort of thing. But I think the attitude should be when you've graduated from school, then you're a beginner. You qualify to be a beginner. You're not suddenly a masterful musician because you went to Berkeley. You might be anyway, because a lot of masterful players do that. But it's just the beginning. Now you have to get the experience on stage, and you've got to play with musicians who hopefully are older than yourself and more experienced, and learn from them. I mean, there's not that many Art Blakeys left in the world, but you find a similar musician, find someone who's willing to play with younger players and who you can learn from.
Yeah, I think you.
This really can't be taught. All you can do is just make sure that you're not making mistakes by, your fingering being wrong or you're having a bad mouthpiece.
Yeah, I think you just gave me a quote that I will use and I'll attribute to, and that is, if you graduate from music school, you're ready to be a beginner. I like that. When we transcribe this, I got to make sure I got it word for word.
Oh, that's quite all right.
Well, your point about really learning how to play the music and involves post education and getting up on stage with people that are better than you or more experienced.
Yeah, because if you're only playing with musicians your own age, after a while you won't be able to learn as much. You can develop some skills, but there are things that veterans can teach you after having played on stage for 20 or 30 or longer years.
Mm-hmm.
Not temporary.
Has there been a period of years, for whatever reason, jazz journalism and authorship was more difficult than others?
Yeah, in the older days, say before 1970 or so, there were less recordings coming out, and there were less opportunities to write. But then again, you had some really tremendous writers. Some of the ones who I read when I was starting out were just great. Then they all had their faults and their good points. But I mean, my early heroes were Leonard Feather, because he was so dominant during that era. Even though he's not perfect, there are certain things that I could talk about him for an hour. But Leonard Feather, Nat Hentoff, and Stanley Dance, who, even though he hated bebop, he was great when he talked about swing. He really interviewed all these people. And Whitney Balliet, I discovered after a little while, he was just a poetic writer. And the only one that's still with us, Dan Morgenstern, was also, I read him early on. Mm-hmm. And those three were the giants. Well, now there are a lot more writers, I think, but there's no one that dominates the field. Gary Giddens was great. He's my generation. He and Francis Davis, I rated them both very high. Mm-hmm. The current writers, most of them are quite good. I just can't think of anyone that I would pick out and say, "Oh, he's the best one," or "She's the best one" right now.
Mm-hmm. What about the every few years a controversy, or at least a debate, is raised about who owns jazz. Is jazz an African American art form, or is it? What happened to the white innovators? Have you ever gotten in the middle of that subject matter?
Not too much. I usually avoid it, but to tell you the truth, now jazz was founded by African Americans, and it's a great music, but it's not the only. Here's a couple of statements that are said that quite often I don't agree with it. Jazz is not America's only art form, and it's not only an American art form. I mean, what's ragtime, and what is tap dancing and movies and even country music to an extent? They're all art forms, and they're not jazz. It's different. So jazz isn't the only one, and also jazz was purely American up until about 1920 or so, and then at that point in time, the recordings became available around the world, and at that point, Europeans could play jazz.
Mm-hmm.
Certain securities they were able to play, but South Americans can. It's not only American, and it's not only by African Americans, because they've been white innovators since the 20s. It was founded by the blacks, and you could say it's their heritage, one aspect of their heritage, but it belongs to anyone with open ears.
Mm-hmm.
It belongs to any musician who's creative enough and skilled enough to be able to play it.
Do you have an opinion about what I think is a sometimes overused word, and that is the term genius? What makes a person or an artist rise to the level of a genius?
I don't really know, because the word is definitely overused. I mean, you could be a genius in one area, musical genius, and not necessarily be smart in other aspects of your life. I think if someone comes up with a completely new way of playing, say in jazz, like Charlie Parker, or someone who has just so many innovations in their career, like Duke Ellington, you'd call them geniuses. But if someone just plays their instrument well and they have a nice sound, genius is kind of overused.
Do you have a short list of your favorite jazz artists?
Well, it wouldn't be short, of course. I can name a thousand. I think there are 6 that are not necessarily my favorites. Well, Louis Armstrong's my favorite of all of them. He's my favorite jazz artist. And so much joy in his playing from all aspects of his career, any period. I love the way he phrases and the sound. But if I would name the ones that I think are the obvious ones that are the most important to jazz history, there'd be 6. Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, and John Coltrane. I don't think anyone's going to argue too much with that. You can add another dozen to that, from Ornette Coleman, maybe Chick Corea and Count Basie, and many, many others. But basically, I have hundreds of favorites. So you'd have to say, well, what instrument, what time period?
Yes, exactly. Well,
there's millions.
I like the bulletin board behind you. I wonder what makes your bulletin board.
Well, if it was a colorful picture I happen to get, or if it's something that's humorous.
Okay.
I have enough for 3 more, but don't have the space.
Well, speaking of humor, I did a double take on your website when I read some of your testimonials. I said, I have to get some of these. For instance, Cab Calloway, who said Scott Yanow is hep to the jive. And you have one from Louis Armstrong next to King Oliver. Scott Yanow is my biggest inspiration of all the cats.
I want to see if anybody's paying attention, really.
Yeah.
There are people there that I never met.
Yes.
Sometimes you read resumes and there'll be endless testimonials. Oh, this person played at my wedding, and that's all nice, but
yes. Yeah, and the people who include every person they ever backed up, even though they might have been in a 30-piece orchestra, a one-time shot, right? Played on stage with.
Yeah, to read the resumes closely, I guess.
What's on your to-do list at the moment?
God, I don't know. I don't know what I'm on. I've been listening to a lot of reissues, but recently I listened to some Stan Kenton ballad albums because I reviewed for one magazine, and then a George Duke album that actually has him playing jazz in the early 70s. But as far as new music goes, I don't know. There's a Nat Cohen record, a Brazilian album.
Yes.
And I'm looking forward to getting the John Coltrane "A Love Supreme," the live version that just came out. So, but it's on a moment's notice. When in doubt, I'll put on Eddie Condon, or I'll put on Dixieland. The thing is, sometimes people get depressed, and I say, well, put on Dixieland, world's happiest music. You'll be happy.
And I want to take note that you mentioned John Coltrane, followed by the phrase "a moment's notice." Well done, even if it was an improvisation.
Well, that's in my mind, I'm constantly jumping between eras and what I listen to. I mean, jazz, ever since I first got into jazz 50 years ago, I've never been bored, except when I'm away from it.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. How many hours a day do you write normally?
It's constant, I mean, 4 or 5 hours, sometimes longer, sometimes less. But
Hmm.
if I'm not writing, I almost always have jazz on the stereo.
Do you ever put anything on like Mozart to sort of reset your ears for a while? No.
I think I have 3 classical albums.
Okay.
It's just that what I'll do is I'll switch styles. Yeah, when you go from swing to completely avant-garde or fusion to bebop, then you're not listening to the same music all the time anyway. And it's just with classical music. I mean, if I didn't get into jazz, maybe I would have gotten into that. But I spent a lifetime listening to 100 years of jazz. I really can't spend the time to listen to 400 years of classical. There's just no time.
Yeah, that's an interesting statement, and it's fascinating to me how many stylistic changes there have been in 100 years. And I guess if jazz started about the same time, congealed as an music when recording started, which was very fortuitous for it.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing. I mean, the evolution of jazz, particularly on record, is really fascinating from about 1917 to the late 70s and maybe early 80s. It's just like a constant race towards freedom. It starts. Each style is a little freer than the one before, but it got to the point where you got Cecil Taylor, and how do you get freer than that? So then, from that point on, musicians had to use aspects of the past along with their own personality and their own ideas, combine things together, and it's made it difficult because there are so few there are no names for any of the styles anymore. Any of the styles since, let's say, since 1980. I mean, you might have retro swing. Okay, that's people reviving aspects of swing, or you might have M bass or Steve Coleman stuff, or you might say, oh, this is the Young Lions, that's hard bop, but basically no new styles. But on the other hand, there's 1,000 new styles. It's like, what do you call Pat Metheny's music? What's John Scofield play? I don't know. What's Jason Moran doing? It's so in a way that it makes it look like jazz isn't evolving, even though it is. Jazz is evolving in an infinite number of directions at once, rather than one main direction.
Mm-hmm.
Right about. Also, it makes the music rewarding to listen to because there's so many more surprises.
Yeah, you have to. Makes it harder for you to put a label on it, I guess, because it.
Yeah, for fusion. What's the music for the last 40 years sound like?
Yeah.
There should be more names, but there aren't any.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I admire you for finding this career and sticking with it for so long, and what we call big ears between musicians, and you obviously have big ears for all the styles and appreciate them, and I congratulate you for that.
Oh, thanks. Well, it's great fun. I mean, I have a 30-second commute to work. I am. Complaints about it, but I could complain and say, "Oh, I have to listen to records all day long."
Yeah.
No,
well, great. Thanks for your time today. I'm going to pause our recording, and then we'll say our goodbyes.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. It's been great fun.
All right.